All right. Well, hey, David Petty, thank you so much for joining us. I want to make the connection here between spirituality and video games. And I want to do that through maybe hearing your story of when or how did you make a connection between gaming and spirituality? What led you to pull those two seemingly disparate things together?
Yeah, so for me, it was a lot of looking at community and how community functions in churches, and the fact that a lot of churches function kind of primarily as a community and secondarily as a spiritual space. So I guess I was starting by thinking about how communities and gaming, and then communities and faith, and really realizing that those things are so far different. And in the Venn diagram of people that go to church and the Venn diagram of people that are in gaming, there's not a lot of overlap, the people that are gaming and go to church. And so I thought, what if there was kind of an outreach, to use a term, evangelistic way to reach people that are playing video games with church messaging, to try to bring church more into the digital space. So originally it started when I made a connection between a college fraternity that I was a part of, and they had this online video game group, I guess you could call it, in a Facebook group, and there were like 1,000 members in the Facebook group. And so if you wanted to hop into a video game with somebody else that was in the fraternity somewhere else in the country, you could hop into a video game because somewhere somebody was online, and there were usually a couple dozen people available who were just saying, hey, I'm hanging out playing video games. If you want to connect, and you jump into a Discord chat together. That's a voice chat app. And so it was like this instant connecting point to create community through like-minded individuals over gaming. So gaming was kind of the affinity that people shared, and then they could connect there. So I thought, what if instead of the fraternity that I was a part of, is a music fraternity, Phi Mu Alpha, national music fraternity, what if instead of the music fraternity, it was church? And what if the affinity that we shared was a love of our faith and deepening our faith? And we created a community of gamers around that idea. I don't know if I answered the question. I was kind of all over the place.
I'm curious, just as to your perception, like, why do you think in your Venn diagram that you've drawn out for our minds, why there's so little interlap between people of gaming and people of faith?
Some of it's demographics. You look at generationally, the people in a lot of our pews and a lot of our churches, certainly in the Methodist Church, tends to be a much older congregation. So, if you look at the group of people, let's say 50 and up, and then the group of those that are 50 and up that are avid gamers, you probably don't have a lot of those. And so then when you look at the group of people that are avid gamers, I forget the statistic. I think the average gamer is like 37 years old. And it really ranges everywhere from 10 years old to 60. There are some on the fringes that are younger and older. But the average gamer being 37 years old, well, that's, young adulthood is a primary group that is missing from a lot of our churches. People go away after they graduate high school, then they go to college, they kind of disconnect from the church, and then we see people coming back to the church when they have kids, when they really are looking for something deeper, and they're saying, I'm having this family, I'm doing something, I'm getting more involved in my community, but there's just something missing. Maybe I'll come back to church. So we're seeing this big group of people that just kind of disconnect from conversations around their faith. And those people are, instead of coming to church, maybe playing video games. Not all of them, but some of them for sure.
So what got you started in video games? Not the overlap, but just video games in general.
Well, I was a kid in the 80s and 90s. And so for me, some of it was just being in the culture where video games grew up. My best friend growing up had a Nintendo Entertainment System, and we'd get together and play Mario. And then a little bit later, I had another friend that had a Sega Genesis, and we'd play on the Sega Genesis. And then eventually, it was Tony Hawk Pro Skater on the PlayStation. Yeah. And all the while, I was also playing games on my PC. Starting off from the earliest that I can remember, I played a DOS-based version of Pac-Man called Pac-Gal. Right? It's probably one of the first games I can remember. And then through...
Did it load on cassette tape or floppy disk?
No, it was. It actually was built into the OS. It was on a 386, IBM 386. It's built into the DOS operating system there. But
I played Asteroids.
Yeah.
Asteroids, like on the computer, was like the first, like it was on there, first game, and then it was Backyard Baseball with the floppy disk.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
So I just kind of grew up with it, and it was always a part of my background. At some point in college, I kind of gave it up, and later in life said, I feel like I'm missing play in my life. I'm missing fun. I'm just working, and I'm working hard, and that's great. I'm putting food on the table, but I'm missing that element of play somewhere in my life. And so I kind of rediscovered video games. I think it started off with the reboot of the Tomb Raider series. I had played Tomb Raider growing up, Tomb Raider 1 and 2. And so they rebooted the series, and I said, well, let me try that out. And then I got back into StarCraft 2 and some other games that really kind of brought me back into video games.
So for perspective, if you don't mind sharing, how old were you when you kind of re-entered the video game realm?
I was probably in my late 20s.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And was this...
So there's a whole like decade there that when I talk to people, they're like, oh, do you remember this game? And I'm like, that's when I was, on hiatus from video games. I took this break in the middle there.
Were you a parent when you re-entered? You are now.
I was, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And that was part of it. I was working three jobs. I had a full-time job. I had 2 part-time jobs. I was doing wedding photography. So I was just working myself like crazy, and didn't really have a lot of fun in my life other than, going on dates with my wife and playing with the kids. But there was no solo me time, and remembering how much fun that was as a kid to go on those adventures, to explore those worlds. I'll tell you more about that later, but that's part of what I think brought me back, was to say, I need to go on some solo adventures and interact with some narrative stories here.
I see a little bit of overlap in the gaming and church world, because both can be kind of intimidating to enter into. Like when you start talking about online gaming, I've always been shy to do online gaming because my fear is that everybody else is so much better than me. Like I'm going to log in and I'm going to get torched by a 12-year-old kind of deal. So was there some of that, I guess, trepidation for you when you were getting back into the gaming world, and were you introduced to kind of the community aspect of gaming?
Yeah. So for me, I think there has always been a little bit of trepidation, still is, in multiplayer games. And I have to talk with my kids now about it. My son started playing Fortnite, and he was really frustrated that he was losing every single match. And we had to say, look, you're playing this game that there are people out there you're playing against, and they've been playing it for 5 years. So these people have been putting in hundreds, if not thousands of hours getting good at this game. It's going to take you a while. And so now, we look back and we're like, hey, now you just won Fortnite twice in a row. Do you remember back when you were not so good, and pick up a new game, and he's frustrated that it's not so easy, and we have to have that conversation all over again. So for me, it's always been a matter of just reminding myself of that, and saying, you're going to get torched by a 12-year-old, but hopefully you don't lose yourself in it, depending on maybe where you are on the Enneagram or your personality type, to say, at least I can have fun even if I lose. The other thing is I play a lot of single-player narrative games. So, Tomb Raider is a good example. It's not multiplayer. It's a single-player narrative game. I can put it on easy mode, or I can put it on hard mode, and it's really just me versus me. It's like running a marathon. Most marathon runners don't consider that they're competing against other people. You're just competing against your personal best. So I personally like a lot of single-player narrative games because they allow for that difference of ability level, and for you to make that adjustment much more openly and readily available for people, and for people of all ability levels, right? We talk in the church a lot about creating open and inclusive spaces for people of all abilities and walks of life. Some games are not so available for people of different ability levels, but a lot of single player narrative games have become more and more available. And that's a whole nother conversation for another time, but yeah.
So you started CrossFire, Faith, and Gaming with another friend community. So tell us kind of what started that. We've already, I think, alluded to it some. And then what does that look like in and of itself?
Sure. So CrossFire, Faith, and Gaming, I actually started it by myself. I've had another friend who's now kind of my co-host and right-hand man. He's, he probably does more than I do in the thing. Certainly when it comes to streaming, he's more active than I am. But I started by myself back in 2017 when I asked this question, could there be an online faith-based community for gamers? And when it started, it was actually a group of like 10 to 12 people, and we were just having the question and having the conversation of, could this thing exist? And then it became a conversation among 20 people that we were saying, could this thing exist? And then we said, well, why don't we meet up on Monday nights and talk this a little bit deeper? And then it became, an online conversation, a Facebook group of 40 or 50 people. And then I realized in having the conversation, we had created the group. So we were having conversations, Monday nights on Discord. We were having conversations in the Facebook group. We were live streaming ourselves playing video games. In the midst of all that, and in meeting Russ Dornish, who's my co-host for our podcast, we then decided to start a podcast. And he then does a lot of video streaming of himself playing on Twitch as well. And so it just kind of slowly evolved and snowballed. And we tried really hard not to have too much of an idea. I'll use the Facebook analogy. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie The Social Network or heard kind of the story behind Facebook. Early on when they were talking about, we should monetize and we should do ads. And, the story is that Mark Zuckerberg was like, we don't even know what this thing is yet. I don't want to sell out and make it this thing that it's not, because we're still figuring out what it is. So we've tried to keep an open mind for letting the group flow and change based on who's in it, based on what they're interested in. Whether it's a small group that wants to do a devotional, then we'll do a devotional. Or if it's a group of people that says we want to play games together, like Sea of Thieves or Rocket League or Fortnite or something like that. So, and then in answer to your question of what is it and how does it look, we've been very intentional not to create a virtual representation of a physical church. There's a lot of online churches that say, we're going to have church online, so we're going to build a game where we're going to build a building where all of our avatars walk into the same building, and we sit and we listen to one person's avatar talk to us. And that's, to me, that's forgetting that the medium is part of the message, right? So thinking about the core principle of what is church, right? That church is a place where we gather, we worship, we fellowship, we have community, we exist in kind of the four Wesleyan quadrants of worship, devotion, mercy, and justice. And so how do we do things in those four quadrants? And then saying, okay, knowing that we're trying to do community, fellowship, worship, devotion, mercy, and justice online, how do we do that online? And that doesn't look like a building, that doesn't look like stained glass, that doesn't look like organ music, but we're still doing church. So we have a Facebook group. We have conversations in there all the time about faith, or just, hey, what's going on in the video game sphere of, did you see this latest Spider-Man trailer, which you all should not watch because there's tons of spoilers in it. Just be careful. Be very gentle with your hearts. So we do that on Facebook. We meet Monday nights on Discord. We have voice chat there. We have done Lenten and Advent devotionals that Russ and I put out as podcast recordings and videos. We've done a devotional. I've actually got a book here that I'd recommend. We've done a devotional based on this book called Thy Geekdom Come. And it's, we did a devotional out of here based on The Mandalorian and the idea of the way and how it relates to the Beatitudes. So super cool stuff. And then, like I said, we have a podcast, we have a Twitch stream, and then some of it is doing what Ryan was talking about in one of his other podcasts, is just showing up in digital spaces, right? Showing up in spaces and saying, hey, you may be having a conversation saying, is playing games a sin? And we have an answer to that. And we have some commentary on that. So showing up in those digital spaces and being our authentic selves. And that's how we're doing church as CrossFire, Faith, and Gaming.
Is that a real conversation that people are like, video gaming is sin?
Yeah. Oh yeah. We have some, some groups
I
that
definitely
we're a
heard
part
that in
of.
the 90s.
Yeah. There's some groups we're part of where those conversations are happening.
Okay.
Every group's a little bit different based on their theology and their church affiliations and, kind of their ecclesiology and political affiliation or lack thereof. So yeah, there's a group of people out there that does definitely think playing games is a sin. They think that, part of it is if you're doing anything that represents violence in a video game, that represents violence in real life.
Okay.
And so there's a lot of conversation there. The other conversations that are had a lot is people think if you're doing something that's secular, right, that if it's not directly church related, and this is kind of the same category of people that say, I don't listen to any music unless it's church music. There are people that say we don't play any games unless they're church games. So then there's groups of people out there trying to say, well, how do I create a church game where you pretend to be Jesus or things like that? And there's some cool games out there. I would definitely name drop my friend George Herrera's project. He's doing a thing called Discover God. That's a VR experience where you get to walk through as the person who's being healed by Jesus. So it's a virtual reality get healed by Jesus experience. So I saw his early project. He's working on expanding it, but pretty cool stuff. But yeah, so there's people having those conversations and we have comments to say back to it.
Yeah. Well, what are some of your comments? Like, if I could put you on the spot, Reverend
Sure.
Petty, be a video game apologetic for us. What's the spiritual value of some of the games you're playing?
Sure. So I'll take your question. I'm gonna shift it a little bit and I'll come back to it.
Sure.
So to have the conversation, like we always have the conversation about screen time, right? Screen time and parenting and kids. And for a long time, people would just say, there's screen time is only okay up to a certain amount. And the conversation becomes about the amount of screen time. But rarely are people having a question or a conversation about the quality of the screen time, right? The answer is not in how much, but what are you doing with it? It's very different if you're saying, hey, kid, go in the other room and play your video games because I don't want to hear from you. That's a very different parenting message than saying, hey, we're going to have family Wii bowling night where we're all going to play Wii bowling together. You could probably do family Wii bowling for 8 hours and not have the detriment of screen time that people talk about because you're having family time. So the same thing I think is true when it comes to, is video gaming a sin? Is how is it being used? Do you have extreme violent thoughts towards other human beings and you play out those fantasies in an online video game? If so, there's probably something deeper that needs to be addressed than the game itself, right? That's I would use the Jesus words here to say there's nothing from outside of a person, Mark 7, nothing from outside of a person that by going in can defile, but it's what comes out of the person, right? So no video game that by you playing it is going to make you sin, but it's depending on what your heart is thinking and doing while you're playing that game. If I'm playing a video game, let's say that's a violent video game, am I taking out other characters because that's part of the mission? The same way that if I am playing Monopoly and I make your character go bankrupt, that's very different than wishing ill on another human being that they would go bankrupt in real life. I don't equate the two. I don't think the people that play Monopoly are going to grow up to be, sadistic bankers. But if you are, then that's a conversation you need to have with a therapist or something like that. And I guess the other place to talk about is video game not just a sin, but is video gaming problematic, is around conversations with addiction, right? There's a lot of people that use video games to fill a void in their life, and then they overuse video games to fill that void, and then they get themselves into a loop of behavior where they can't get out. And so we've had that conversation in the group. I have that conversation with my kids all the time. Like, look, if you're playing video games and not able to get your homework done, you can't have conversations with your friends, you're being mean to your parents, then we need to start having a deeper conversation about what that's really doing with your brain. But during the last year, during the pandemic, I think you mentioned it, Ryan, your experience was the same as my experience about telling my kid, hey, get off Fortnite. It's time to come to dinner. And he's like, well, I've got 3 friends on here that I'm playing with. And I realized this is the only social interaction that you've had because we're not getting together in person. We're not going to the park. We're not going to the pool. So yeah, I guess you can finish the match. And I think from a parenting standpoint, it's important that we as parents are interested in the things our kids are interested in. So for me as a parent, knowing that if my kid says he's playing Fortnite, I can ask how many people are left in the match. And it's very different if there's 80 people or 10 people. What does that say about how much time is left in the match? We're now communicating with a language that he's speaking. 10 people, usually the game's going to be over in like 3 minutes. So we're good. 100 people, well, you just started the match. You need to get off now because I'm not going to let you play another 30-minute match. So be interested in the things your kids are interested in, and that'll help video gaming not become problematic and not be a sin.
Yeah, that's good information. Sorry, Pierce, something here tweaked me a little bit. I'm wondering then, in your community, as you've combined the worlds of gaming and the sphere of faith, have you found some like redemptive value of video games?
Yeah. I mean, there's the social aspect, certainly, finding friends and building community. I love graphics in video games. I have always been a graphics nerd. So it could be the worst video game ever, and it has the worst plot and the worst acting. But man, if the graphics are amazing, it just blows me away. I distinctly remember when Half-Life 1 was out, and I was playing Half-Life 1 as a kid, and Half-Life 2 came out, where they introduced the concept of physics in a game. So if there's wood and something's made of wood, it acts like wood. You can hit it with a hammer and it breaks apart. If something looks like water, it acts like water. It has reflective properties. The fire that's behind a waterfall is going to refract and reflect through that. And I watched this tech demo that came out of E3, the Electronics Entertainment Expo, about Half-Life 2, and I was just mesmerized. And so for the rest of my life, I've always loved graphics in games. And so the thing that does for me is to say, I approach games looking for a sense of awe and wonder, and it reminds me of the awe and wonder that I experience in the real world. So, it's a much easier way to go into a video game, and let's say Red Dead Redemption, for example, which has its redeeming qualities. That's a whole different conversation, but the environments in that game are just stunning. Just what Rockstar was able to do with that game blows me away. I could go into Red Dead Redemption and see a deer running through a stream being chased by a wolf with a mountain in the background and have a sense of awe and wonder at the real creation that's outside. And it doesn't take me 5 hours to drive into the mountains. So
or 2
that's
days
a thing
for some of us. Yeah.
Right. And it's not to say that it's a replacement, but it's a reminder. The same way that I would say that, a prayer written in a book is not a replacement for you having a prayer where you're actually having a relationship with God. But, it's a good in between, right? We recite the Lord's Prayer, some of us from rote memorization every single time. And every now and then we have to stop and say, okay, well, what do these words really mean? What is behind the representation? So that's a place that I've found a redeeming quality of video games. The other thing is the stories that we tell, right? We look at Scripture, and Scripture is primarily stories. It is the stories of when Moses led the people out of Egypt. It's the story of when brothers were fighting and one of them got the blessing. It's the story of, 2 women who were trying to figure out how to survive in a difficult area. Games have stories too, some of them based on scriptural stories, and some of them that just point to a deeper truth to who we are as people, right? So there are ways that those stories, just like a good movie, just like a good book, have this kind of redemptive quality to them because you're interacting with this story and it's happening to you. It's not just something that you're passively reading. And there are games that I would recommend that I would say, you can't just watch a video of this game. You have to play it. You have to play it because you're going to be changed by interacting with this story narratively, interactively, in a way that's totally different than if I just tell you oh yeah, let's say Lord of the Rings. It's about, a hobbit who takes a ring to Mordor to try to destroy it because it's a bad thing. You can't summarize that. Mm-hmm. So reading it or watching it is going to be far more powerful than a summary.
Right. So 18 months ago, when we're filming this, about 18 months ago, the world got rocked with COVID, and a lot of people who were not online became online, especially in the church world. And I remember Palm Sunday of 2020 and watching our Facebook and YouTube services that were live at the time crash. And we had the best internet and we had the best things in our location, but the amount of traffic from the amount of churches that were on those platforms, they just couldn't hold it. They weren't built to hold that amount, And so you have been in the online space, as we've already talked about, for a long time. And the community of faith as a whole is entering into this space anew. And so there's been a lot of conversation around, and our listeners would know this on our side of the podcast, but for your listeners thinking through, I was headed to plant a physical campus, COVID hit, and I became our online pastor. And so, very different spaces. So there's been a lot of conversation in the church world around comparing the two. All right, you get this in online, you get this in person. And usually because tradition has been in person and the online space has been new, it's always been heavy sided to the in person, right? That's the filter in which people have thought through. So I'd love you to talk through, hey, what are things that you can get online that you can't get in person, or you can answer both these, or what are things that you can get both online and in person, but you've actually seen it actually play out better online?
Okay. So I'm just trying to rephrase and wrap my head around the question here. So we're talking about what's online that's not in person, what's in both places, where are places where it's better online and better in person. Gosh.
Well, just better online.
Sure.
Just better online.
Yeah. I think the ability to be in two places at once is something that online offers us. There are times when, I'm on a call with my friends and I've also got to run an errand and go pick something up. In the real world, if I'm going to meet with my friends and I'm going to go pick something up, I got to say, hey, do you guys want to come with me in the car? Cause I've got to go pick up my dry cleaning. Shoot, I do need to pick up my dry cleaning today. Would you mind coming with me and doing this thing? So then they've got to kind of tag along. Well, online, you can say, I'm just going to put you in my ear. I'm going to go pick up my dry cleaning. We're going to still have this conversation. So you can be in two places at once. The other thing I think is a diversity of perspectives, right? We're in person so often we're limited to whoever is in our immediate vicinity. So for a while, I was a pastor in rural Colorado in a tiny little town called Meeker. And, the people in that area were very similar to one another. There were many people that were related to one another or related 3 generations back. They had the same life experience. They had same family of deer that walked through my yard, walks through your yard. The same restaurants we all eat at because there's only 4 in town, that kind of stuff. And for the most part, when it came to like how that interacted with the perspective you got, 90% of people from that town voted the same way as everybody else. So, there was no diversity of thought to where you could say, well, maybe I disagree with you, or maybe I have a different opinion than that. Online, it's really easy. We were on a Discord call the other night. We had someone from California, someone from Ohio, someone from Kentucky, someone from Colorado, someone from Montana, and somebody in Florida. And we're able to talk to one another and say, how are things over there? And tell me what you're experiencing in this. And, and the other thing is our theologies are regionally different. Even within the Methodist Church, you're going to find a very different theology going into a Methodist church in Portland than you are in Pennsylvania, versus going into a Methodist church in California versus going into one in San Antonio. Totally different. So that diversity of perspective then gives us conversations that I don't think would normally happen in an in-person setting.
That's good. It's really good.
Speaking of this overlap, when you were talking about the four spheres of, not the four spheres, but the four areas of, I guess, Wesleyan community, you talked about worship being one of them. I was wondering, what does worship look like in your community?
That's a great question. Mostly because we're still asking it.
Yeah.
For us,
a lot of people are. That's why I'm so keen on this.
No. For the most part, a lot of us are kind of. Some of us are distantly connected with churches. Some of us are like, one guy's a tech director at his church. I'm the pastor at a church. There's other people that are kind of disparately connected. So we're all worshiping, I think, in our own ways. We're not really yet worshiping as a community. So that's tough, because communal worship, I guess the closest we've gotten was there were a couple of times where we said, I've shared online versions of church with the group. So I'll say, hey, everybody, this week at St. Paul's, we had a really good thing, and, check it out. But that's not the same as communal worship, but it's at least the version of online worship everybody else is getting in the world today. So I guess if we were to create something, part of which is just human resource time issues, we're not millionaires. We don't get paid to do this. And for the most part, most of us are just volunteers in this labor of love. We could create a worship service specifically aimed at this demographic, where, we could have litanies that are based on kind of common pop culture or media or gaming references. The same way we talked about like the devotion that we did out of The Mandalorian. I could preach a sermon that has a lot more gaming references than real life references. Very much the same way that when I was serving in Meeker, because that was a predominantly ranching and farming community where they all went to the rodeo on Thursday nights or Friday nights. My conversations with them were a lot different than they would be if I were in an urban setting. I used a lot more ranching metaphors and ranching illustrations in my sermons than I would otherwise. So I think that would be a place where worship could change, but I'm actually just really curious if anybody out there has great ideas for an online only community and what worship looks like, and what worship looks like in a way that's not top down hierarchical, one person at the front leads everybody else, but what does communal worship look like, where we come together in a space to say we're going to worship together in this virtual or digital space. So we're still working that now.
Yeah, I think
we haven't answered it yet.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and something I've been thinking about a lot. I'm doing a study right now around food and the church and the body, and the pastor that's leading the study, I'm doing it digitally, kind of thing. It's like an online course, whatever. But one of the things he talked about that I've been taking this thing for a few months now, but this is like the first week I've been shifting my mindset in how I think about what he's teaching and online. So I know that's a lot, but here's my point. In the early church, the church came around the community, and it was a house church, it was oppressed in the beginning. So it came around, and it didn't have a singular leader in the sense of a pastor stood up, but it was like, hey, we're going to eat together. We're going to be in community together. Now you sing a song. Is your song going to be a hymn, or is it going to be one you made up? Is it, we're going to pray. We're going to open the scriptures. We're going to dialogue. And it was a really interesting correlation that he talked about, where he said, if you look at how like church architecture moved from the round to, like, if you go look at like the old churches in England or places like that, where it's like a cross, and now it's a theater. Right? It is somebody up there talking down to everybody else listening. And so in that world, in and of itself, I think that's where a lot of us have maybe gotten it wrong in online church, is thinking online church is supposed to be like in-person church, where the family puts the computer or they screen to the TV and they just receive everything. When actually, because of the medium of online and digital, it actually works better like the original church, where it is way more conversational. It is way more led, in that you do need to have leadership, and the early church had leadership. But I think online could pull us back to some of those early church days of what it actually looked like, and what Jesus did it like, versus I'm not against the in-person gathering. I'm going to stand up next week and preach to, a bunch of people. So, but I've not made the correlation between those two until recently, and hearing you talk about it brought it all back. And I think we've got to look at the medium differently as we talk about online church and not try to replicate in-person worship in person or online.
I think the other comment I would have listening to you talk about that is that, online, and probably for most of us, we should get back to this in person. I think the categories are far more fluid and messy, and they don't have such neat and even lines where you say, okay, we've got a food bank, and that is a ministry of mercy, because that is helping people who need help now. And then we've got this thing where we go down to the courthouse and we advocate for something, and that is justice, because we're doing that, it fits in the silo called justice. And then anything we do in the sanctuary, because it's in the sanctuary and we're singing and praying and sermonating in the sanctuary, that's called worship because it's in the sanctuary. But a lot of what you were talking about is like, we can worship in a way that we're also doing fellowship, and we can worship in a way that's also devotion. And just because we're not singing a song and putting our hands in the air doesn't mean it's not worship.
Right. And we can do that. I mean, from that point, it doesn't have to be, making a joke here. It doesn't have to be Chris Tomlin on his little guitar to a screen and everybody follows him. But it can be, we can't think. I'm thinking they're like, I have a 2-year-old daughter, and I dance. This is my first kid. I dance way more in the house than I ever have because I have a 2-year-old little girl, and her favorite thing is to put on videos on the TV of YouTube on whatever kind of music, and we dance to the TV music. And so, I think you're bringing us. I think that's bringing us into a really good space where the church is expanding and needing to grow.
And I want to be a fly on the wall when you guys put some of this stuff into practice. It sounds so fascinating to me. But Reverend David, you have ventured a little bit into the service aspect, or the the justice aspect, so to speak, and serving people around us through your online community. Can you tell us what you've been up to there?
Yeah. So we've decided, in our Twitch stream, which Twitch is an online platform, a video platform. For those of anybody listening that doesn't know what Twitch is, it's an online video platform where you can live stream video of yourself playing video games, or even just yourself talking. But you can live stream yourself playing video games to an audience that then can choose to subscribe to your content. They can chat. That's interactive. You as the streamer see what they're saying on there. They can also then cheer with some like digital bits. So it's like buying a flag at a football game and waving the flag in the air and saying "Go team." You're supporting your team through buying that flag and waving it in the air and giving public support. So the Twitch stream predominantly gets used by people who are trying to make a platform for themselves, trying to become famous, trying to raise money so that they can keep doing it. There's a lot of professional gamers out there that stream on Twitch either because they're funny or because they're good or both. But we said, let's use this platform a little bit differently, and let's have fun. Let's be on there. Let's be in conversation with people, but let's try to use it to raise money for charities. So we've used it to raise money. We started off last year in October, and we raised money for Able Gamers. So we raised like $300 for Able Gamers, maybe 400-ish for Able Gamers, which is an organization that tries to bring games to more people of different ability levels. Excellent organization. I'd highly recommend you to look it up. So we also then had conversations about talking through, what does it look like to bring interaction? That's not the word I'm looking for. What does it look like to bring inclusion to people of different ability levels, right? So Xbox a couple years ago released the ability controller that essentially has a plug-in for every button on the controller, so that you can have a different type of device to do the thing that the controller would normally do. So instead of using your thumb to press the B letter, let's say you don't have a thumb, you could use a foot pedal, and you press that foot pedal and it presses the B on your controller.
Wow.
Or let's say you have a thing that, you move your arm and that does the trigger because you don't have fingers, right? So if you're born without hands, how do you play video games? All the way to, you know, things that we're seeing in new games that came out, like The Last of Us Part 2. They actually have a version of the game, or a thing in the game where you can put it on and you can play the game if you're blind, fully blind. It gives you audio cues. It makes it much easier to aim, changes the whole game, but it says, you know, we're going to bring this narrative experience to somebody who has no sight at all. That's amazing. So anyways, we supported Able Gamers. We supported Extra Life, which is an organization that gives to, they give 100% of their donations to children's research hospitals locally in your area. So you just say we're supporting Extra Life, and then that goes to your local children's hospital. We raised, I want to say like $600, $700 for Extra Life when we did that. St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital. And then there have been a couple others that I can't think of right now, but we've basically tried to use that as a platform to say, we're going to do good in the world of video games and the world around us. We're just going to try to do good stuff in that space. So we're still looking for possibilities of doing missions. We have a lot of ideas. You know, the future, I think, holds some interesting things for us in terms of what missions looks like, or even youth ministry. It's always funny when I talk about the fact we have a gaming ministry. Some people assume it's all youth. The reality is we actually have a few youth, but most of it's people over 18. So, yeah, so that's what we're doing in the mercy and justice quadrants.
Very cool.
It's beautiful. So you've given us a few different books to read and places to look at. I'd never heard of the organization you just talked about, and just mind-blowing just to even get my head wrapped around that. It's really cool. So what should people be checking out right now, just in the world of gaming and kind of community and faith, and then in that, where can they find you guys as well to connect?
Yeah. So I would say, you know, if you're interested in checking stuff out in gaming, there's so much. Definitely check out the organizations that I listed. There's some other cool organizations. I can't remember the name of it, but like there's an organization that brings games and gaming systems and controllers to kids in long-term care facilities. So let's say you've got an 8-year-old kid that gets cancer and they've got to be in the hospital all the time. Rather than just watching the 10 channels that are available on the hospital TV, this group will bring in like a gaming console and your kid can play video games while they've got to be in the cancer ward. So super cool stuff in that realm. As far as video games, I would just, you know, constantly check out, there's a lot of conversations happening in gaming spaces, just like everywhere else in the world, around inclusion, not just of abilities, but also gender inclusion, right? There's a lot happening for Blizzard, game company right now, because of some of the harassment lawsuits they've had going on, and how hard it is for women to break into the games industry. Last I checked, I think it was like 17% of game developers are women, right? Which means that 83% of game developers are men. And that's not the same as the percentages of people who want to be game developers. That's far more close to 50-50. So there's a huge gender gap in the gaming industry. So I would say, you know, stay up on what's happening there, how that's changing. I'm curious to see, you know, always between Xbox and PlayStation and Nintendo, what they're doing in terms of bringing more accessibility and bringing games to more people. Nintendo's great for family games. I'm struggling to come up with, and maybe this is a place you cut out. I don't know if I'm rambling. Trying to figure out like where to direct people to specific gaming stuff if they're not into games. I don't know.
I think you pointed us to a great place.
But then,
great places.
As far as where you can find us, you can find us. We've got a really cool domain name. So if you go to Church for Gamers, that's churchforgamers.com. That'll take you to our website, and that's got links to our Twitch, our podcast, our Facebook group, our Facebook page. So you can find us on Facebook as kind of our primary group. CrossFire Faith and Gaming. It's a CrossFire Faith +Gaming. And then you can also find us on Twitch. I think we are CrossFire Cast on Twitch. But most places you can find us by just looking up CrossFire Faith +Gaming.
Cool. You got an active Discord server and stuff too. So for folks who want to enter into that realm, like,
Yeah.
it's a great way.
And the Discord
great group to
server, you
meet.
just go to discord.churchforgamers.com, and that'll take you into our Discord server where we meet every Monday night. And that's open to everybody, Ryan. I know you said you wanted to be a fly on the wall. You are welcome to be a fly on the wall in any of our online spaces.
Cool. Well, Reverend Patty, thank you so much for sharing this time with us. I look forward to connecting with you online. And yeah, maybe joining in a game or two. Maybe this is the invitation I've needed to jump into the MMO space. So thank you so much.